Okay, so the first thing to identify in the phone is the antenna, because the antenna is the very first part of the transmission of the signal. Basically, a smartphone is a wireless telecommunication device. You're communicating with someone else wirelessly, and in order to do so, you need an antenna. And so to find the antenna in this particular smartphone, we see the antennas. Actually, the antenna is under the surface here, under the gray surface. So if you see these traces, this is a trace for one of the antennas. So the longer the trace, the lower the frequency that the antenna operates at. So this is probably one of the main antennas, which operates at the 4G LTE bands of 700 megahertz, 800, 900 megahertz, and even up to 1 gigahertz. Of course, these frequency bands differ depending on which country. Different countries in Europe, in Asia, South America, the US, the bands will differ depending on the country. But those are the approximately the major bands for the lower frequency. However, the 4G LTE has two bands. One is upper frequency, one is lower frequency. What I just mentioned from 700, 800, 900 megahertz, these are the lower frequency bands of the 4G LTE frequency bands. The upper frequency is 1.8 gigahertz, 1.9 gigahertz, even up to 2 gigahertz. But these phones have Bluetooth capability, GPS capability, NFC, a lot of different capabilities, which are all wireless, meaning they need an antenna. So we can also identify other antennas here. For example, this trace is it's hard to see, but there's a slight indentation in this gray surface, and this is a smaller antenna, which indicates that the frequency is at a higher frequency, maybe 2.4 gigahertz or even 5 gigahertz. Bluetooth and Wi-Fi operate at those frequencies, so this may be one of those antennas. So the signal actually goes through this plastic cover. If the cover was metallic, the signal will bounce off and not go into the motherboard. But because this material is plastic, the signal will go through the plastic, go into this trace, which is a metallic conductive trace, and then it goes through the feed, the antenna feed. And here we see these gray points here, contact points. So this is the feed of one of the antennas. Here we see another feed for another antenna, and here we see another feed. So these gray contact points are where the signals come in from the antenna and into the motherboard. So for the S5, we can see that a lot of the circuitry have been protected and covered using this plastic gray cover. But if we look at this is the S3 phone, and it's a lot easier to see the antenna here. So here we see a dark trace over here, and we see a gap in between, and we see this plastic, this contact point. Underneath the plastic, you have a metallic conductive feed point. So this is the main antenna. It's much clearer here. And as in the S5, we also see a smaller, shorter antenna, which operates at 2.4 or 5 gigahertz for Wi-Fi or Bluetooth capability. This gap in between indicates that this operates at two frequency bands. Like I mentioned before, the 4G LTE works at two frequency bands. One is low frequency, 700, 800, 900 megahertz. One is high frequency, 1.8, 1.9 gigahertz. So that's the very first step, first block of the transmission chain, and then the signal goes into a high frequency circuit board. Okay? And the high frequency circuit board operates at these frequencies of 7, 8, 900 megahertz or 2.4, 5 gigahertz. Then the signals that we hear, the human ear can hear from range of hertz up to very low kilohertz. That's the range that the human ear can hear. But these frequencies are way up in the gigahertz range, meaning we can't hear these or see these signals. So in order for us to hear or see the signals as audio or visual data, these frequencies are down converted to lower frequencies. And it uses something called a mixer, where another frequency is mixed with these high frequencies to lower the total frequency down to the megahertz range. After it's converted to the megahertz range, then it's considered an analog signal. So the antenna signal is a high frequency signal, and then the down converted signal is an analog signal. And then we hear the term, we live in a digital world. That's because most of the circuitry in a smartphone is digital IC, digital integrated circuits, meaning ones and zeros. So after the signal has been down converted to a megahertz signal, then it goes through an ADC. An ADC is called an analog to digital converter. And what that does is it converts the megahertz signal to ones and zeros. And then the digital circuitry will process these signals, these ones and zeros, and that is called digital signal processing. What the digital signal processing can do is it can clean up noise, make the sound or the video or audio signals more crisp, more clear, and it can do all sorts of manipulations, modifications of the signals in the 1 and 0 state. And then it converts those signals to audio signals that we can hear at the lower frequencies of below kilohertz range, around kilohertz or below. And then we have the opposite of that chain, which is what I just explained was receiving the signal. And then we're also sending a signal to the other person. And what we do is when we talk into the phone, our voice audio signals are converted to first of all, it's converted to a digital signal, and then it's converted to an analog signal using something called a DAC. Before I said ADC, which stands for analog to digital converter. DAC stands for digital to analog converter. So we're converting ones and zeros to analog signals. And then it's up converted to the 4G LTE band frequencies. And then it leaves the antenna and goes to a cell phone tower. And from the cell phone tower, it relays to the person you're talking to and transmits to that person's cell phone. So that's the overview of how these phones work. And then so here I pointed out the antennas, and then let's look at the next step after the antennas.